Okay, the machine is alive. So, if you started at this place and got on a dinky little drone and flew 575 miles west, you'd end up in El Paso. And then, if you got into a time machine and went back about 90 years, you'd be in El Paso at the time when this man was a leading citizen. His name's Lawrence Nixon. And Nixon came to El Paso in the early part of the 1900s and voted every single election from 1910 until 1924. But when he came to the polls in 1924 and paid his poll tax, he walked up to the voting booth and was told, "Lawrence, you know you can't vote." And he said, "I know I can't, but I've got to try." Because in 1923, Texas had done something pretty extraordinary. Texas had enacted by law an all-white primary. By law, only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. So the election system in Texas looked something like this. There was a general election, but before the general election, there was a white primary. And to be able to run in the general election, you had to do well in the white primary, a two-stage process which excluded a significant portion of the population in this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, that it produced a democracy responsive to whites only. Now, what Texas did was not particularly Texan. Indeed, it's a trick. It's a kind of well-known trick to defeat democracy everywhere. Boss Tweed loved this trick, as he famously quipped, "I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating." This Cherry Street philosopher whose conception of democracy was, how do I make sure democracy doesn't work? We can call the system Tweed wanted Tweedism. And once we see it like this, we will see it everywhere. A two-stage process with a filter in the middle that biases the process against what the people of a democracy want. This is what we saw in Hong Kong last summer. Last summer, Hong Kong fell apart as hundreds of thousands of people came to the streets to protest a law that set up the procedure by which the new chief executive would be selected. That law said the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon a nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee, a nominating committee of 1,200 citizens, which means in a population of about 7 million, that's 0.02% of the population that gets to nominate the candidates who get to run in the general election. Now, 0.02% is really, really tiny. There it is. You can barely see it on that screen. If you thought of a one individual person against the mass of the population, 0.02% looks like this. It is 1 out of every 5,000 citizens. 1 out of every 5,000 got to participate in the committee that selects the candidates who Hong Kong gets to vote among. This is Tweedism. And it triggered a strike because the people of Hong Kong believed this was a biased filter. They said 1,200 would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. As Martin Lee, Hong Kong's chairman of the Democratic Party, put it, "We want a genuine universal suffrage, not democracy with Chinese characteristics." This system, they thought, was not democracy. How could it be democracy when 0.02% selected the candidates who get to run in the general election? Okay, now, before you commit yourself too strongly to the view that this can't possibly be democracy, let me tell you a little bit about this place, the United States. In the United States, campaigns are privately funded. We take it for granted. It has to be. How could it be any way different from this? Privately funding. But that process of funding is its own contest. We could think of it as its own primary. Candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars to raise the money they need to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do this, through a process of osmosis, they learn what works. They get ideas about how to talk to attract the money they need. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters. As they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. B.S. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box. Any stupid animal could learn which buttons it had to push to get the sustenance it needs. This is the picture of the modern American congressperson. As he or she learns which buttons must be pushed to get the sustenance their campaigns need to win or to get the parties back in power. This is a primary. It is a money primary. Not a white primary, a green primary. It is one stage in an election. And when you think about credibility of candidates, it's become the most important stage. Zephyr Teachout's extraordinary woman who ran in the Democratic primary against this man, Andrew Cuomo, for governor of New York. She's brilliant. She had an incredible platform driven to the question of corruption, but Andrew Cuomo refused to debate her. Why did he refuse? Not because she's a woman, not because she's young. He refused to debate her because she had no money. She raised $400,000 against his $30 million. She was not credible. Or think about Buddy Roemer. In 2012, Buddy Roemer was the most qualified candidate running for president in the Republican primary. He was a 3-term congressman. He had been a governor. He had started a community bank. But Buddy Roemer had decided to run a campaign where he took no big money, no more than $100 from anybody. And that made him not credible. So he could not even get in a single debate. The most qualified candidate was not permitted on the stage because he didn't have the money. The green primary is the filtering stage for those who want to run in our election, and this filter is biased. It is biased because of who the funders are. The funders. In the 2014 election, 5.4 million Americans gave even $1 to any campaign. That's about 1.7% of America. But of that 5.4 million, the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million. That top 100 gave 70% of the super PAC money that was spent in that election cycle. So what is the amount you have to give before you give enough to be relevant to the candidates, relevant to them as they think about the policies they're going to pursue? What is the number that makes you a big giver? Because the number of people giving large amounts is really, really small. If you gave the maximum amount in any one cycle, that's $2,600. There were 124,000 Americans who gave $2,600. That's 0.04% of America. Or what if you gave the maximum amount you're allowed to give one candidate in any full election cycle, $5,200? $5,200. Well, it turns out that 57,854 Americans gave $5,200. And I was startled, though not surprised, to discover 57,854 Americans is about 0.02% of America. 0.02%. Do you remember that number? 0.02%. Who might be giving enough to qualify. Most people in Washington would say $5,200, that's nothing. But the point is, if it is even that little amount, the same percentage as in China. A tiny fraction of the 1%, we could say a Chinese fraction of the 1% dominate this first stage. And the consequence is a democracy responsive to the funders only. Princeton study. I'm not allowed to cite Princeton studies, so let's put that off the stage as quickly as we can. Princeton study by Martin Guylands and Ben Page, the largest study of actual policy decisions by our government in the history of political science, linking actual decisions our government made to the attitudes of the economic elite, organized interest groups, and the average voter. And what they found was, as the economic elites supported a policy in a higher and higher percentage, the probability of that policy passing went up. And the same with organized interest groups. As more interest groups supported a policy, the more likely it was that policy would be adopted. Here's the graph for the average American voter. It is a flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is, it doesn't matter how many of the average voters actually support something. It doesn't affect the probability of our government actually doing that thing. It is a flat line. There's no connection between what the average voter thinks and what our government does, only if the average voter happens to agree with the economic elite or organized interest groups. As they put it in English, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. Now, we should just pause for a second to understand what that's saying. Because here it is, a picture of American democracy. Now, you're thinking, really, it can't be American democracy. But, in the middle of the country, that's kind of a picture of us, okay? The point is, here's a picture of American democracy. It is a bus driver who has discovered the wheel no longer drives the bus. We are the democracy that no longer has a connection between the average voter and what our government does, the most basic function of a democracy, of a representative democracy, what our framers called a republic. That most basic function has been lost. And lost for the same reason African Americans lost control over their democracy in the beginning of the 1900s. Lost because of a fundamental inequality that's at the center of our system, an inequality of citizens. Okay, so conventional wisdom, this is kind of cute. I found this on the web. I actually stole it from this girl blogger. But you see, that's like a convention, name tag. So it's wisdom, conventional wisdom. Get it? Okay, so conventional wisdom says that people don't care about this issue. Politico wrote, quoting a consultant, "It's a zero issue. No one cares. They shrug. They already believe that all politicians are corrupt assholes. It's baked in the cake. They get it." And the truth is, maybe that's right. Maybe that's right. Maybe people just don't care. But I think this may be actually a confusion. The fact that we don't observe people doing much about it might actually be a confusion. Not that they don't care, but something else is going on. We did a poll at the end of 2013. We asked, how important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? 96% said it was important to reduce the influence of money in politics. But the next question was, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? The answer is 91% did not think it was likely. So, just like 96% of us would love to fly like Superman, but because at least 91% of us don't believe we can, we don't leap off of tall buildings regularly, we accept the reality of our situation, so too with politics. There is not apathy here, but resignation. Our system is corrupt. There's nothing we can do about it. We've modified, we've amended Ben Franklin's slogan, "Nothing is certain but death and taxes and a corrupt government." But the point is, if we could show that it was possible, if we could convince people there is actually a way to fix this problem, then, okay, we can all have a dream, right? Not quite that. But then we can imagine people actually doing something, stepping up to fix it. And here's the fact. It is possible. Or as my students say, it's totally possible. Totally possible. Because we could solve 90% of this problem with a single statute. A statute that changes how campaigns are funded, a statute that brings into effect small-dollar citizen-funded campaigns, a statute like ones proposed by Democrats and proposed by Republicans, a statute that would spread out the funder influence. So it's not the 0.02%, it's not the 1%, it's not the 10%, but it is as many people funding as are voting. It's all of us, so that our democracy is responsive to all of us. And right now, in Congress, 1/3 of Congress has committed to supporting those changes by co-sponsoring proposals that would fundamentally change the way campaigns are funded. And what that means is all we must do is to move that 1/3 to a half. And so the question is, what is a strategy, or what are the strategies that we should adopt or could adopt to move us from that 1/3 to 1/2? And my view is every damn thing that we could find that would work. Now here's one. Here's one strategy. Change is going to take a law. And the law will need both the support of a president and support of a Congress. So we need to think first about the strategy with respect to a Congress. And that's the opportunity for me to describe a little bit today about what Mayday version 2 wants to do. So it's just about exactly a year ago at TED when I described the idea of Mayday. Mayday as in the distress signal, which we sloganized to be the super PAC to end all super PACs. The idea is we would kickstart, sort of, because Kickstarter doesn't allow you to do politics, but we'd kickstart a campaign to raise a credible pile of money to run an experiment, to test through a series of campaigns whether it's possible to win a Congress committed to fundamental reform by picking and supporting candidates who've made this a central issue in their campaign. Now, to do this, I described we would take 2 steps. The first step is the step of raising money. I said we'd raise $1 million in 30 days, and then we'd get that matched. Then I said we'd raise $5 million in 30 days and get that matched, so we'd have $12 million to run this experiment. And this turned out to be incredibly successful. We raised $1 million in 13 days. I got that matched in 2 weeks. We then raised $5 million in 30 days. And then we came close to getting that matched. 4 out of the 5 got matched. So we had $11 million to run our campaign. Never has as much been raised for this issue in such a short time ever, which pissed off a lot of people, I'm sure. But the point is, we had shown something through the more than 50,000 people who had stepped up to support the experiment, to see whether we could do something to restore, to recover, to get back a democracy. And then that led to step 2, which was the launch of these campaigns, which quickly turned out to be something other than what we expected, leading egghead to Politico to refer to me as an egghead and the idea as a complete bust. Okay, but here's the thing. Did we move the dial in the races that we were in? Of course we did. Did we disprove the conventional wisdom that Americans don't care about this issue? Of course we did not. Though the stat geeks looked at our data and they said, look, you can see, people care, look at the way they move. The point is, DC is geek-free. And from their perspective, the perspective of conventional wisdom, this experiment had failed. And so, with this failed experiment, we then just gave up, quit. Went home. I took up Minecraft and some knitting and figured that was going to be the rest of my life. No, look, obviously not. The experiment failed. But we don't quit. We don't give up. We learn. And then we try something new. And we try something new until it works. So here's the lessons we learned. First, if you're going to do something different, you got to be different. We've seen a million examples of people talking about change surrounded by behaving in the same way. And what it turns out is that if you talk about change surrounded by same sort of behavior, you become the same too. And number two, to be different in this context means to find a way to remove the partisan frame from this fight. Because to wage a partisan battle in the middle of partisan wars is not to strike people as anything different. The negative ads arguing for a reformer are almost oxymoronic. Nobody thinks anything's changing here. They just think one side is trying to win over the other, especially when it's one side trying to defeat a party from another side. So our insight, the thing we learned, is we had to find a way to push the fight back from the general election to primary elections, and from primary elections to a time when there are no elections, to a time when it's not about scaring people by the threat that we'll kick them out, but when it's a time that we can talk to people, representatives, and engage them as people about a problem they agree exists. So to move from electing representatives to the task of recruiting citizens, to the task of citizens recruiting their representatives, citizens asking representatives to step up and to lead on this issue. And so today, this afternoon, we launched the first of two steps to make that possible on the Mayday site. Step one is a process to begin to identify who are the leaders in Congress, the members of Congress, who we could rally to become leaders in this cause. As we move from 1/3 to 1/2, who would lead on this issue, and why would they lead? And that first step invites people to suggest people and reasons, and then in our subreddit, we engage the conversation about why people will be leaders and what we can do to bring them about. And so that by the time we get to the anniversary of the launch of Mayday, May 1, Mayday, we will be able to launch a fundamental platform for citizen lobbying, a platform that enables citizens to engage in the task of lobbying representatives to bring them around to commit to fundamental reform. And in the first iteration of that platform, there are two functions it will enable. The first function is to make it so that our 50,000-person army can turn to voters in targeted districts and get them to connect with representatives in those targeted districts and to say to those representatives, will you lead? So we can recruit them to commit to fundamental reform, whether of the Democratic flavor or the Republican flavor. And then a second step is a technique first built by my friend Aaron Swartz. When he and I started this work more than 8 years ago, Aaron said we have to find a way to get people to stop participating in the funding system. He said we have to get them to strike. And so he built a tool 5 years ago that made it possible for people to sign up to say they promise not to give to anybody who does not support fundamental reform. And the tool went out and queried the FEC database to figure out how much were they worth, what kind of giver were they. So if they were a person who gave $50,000, we counted $50,000 on strike. Well, that tool is being revived and made more targeted to become a funder's pledge, where in the targeted districts, we will reach out to the largest contributors and say to them, we want you to make this pledge that you pledge not to give to any candidate if they are not committed to fundamental reform. We're giving them an excuse to say no, a public-spirited reason to say no. Who wouldn't want that when a politician calls you? To be able to say, I'm sorry, I'd love to, but I can't unless you support fundamental reform. Now, both of these ideas are at this stage tentative, to be tested. Because what we're doing in this machine is to build a machine that is driven by the data. We start with a few districts and see what works. And over time, using the data that we get from this citizen lobbying machine becomes better, with this ultimate aim, by the end of this year, to change conventional wisdom, So the conventional wisdom says, winning is at least plausible in Congress. But the truth is, in the nature of American politics today, a strategy also requires a president. And the second thing I described in the TED Talk last year was a project that had been inspired also by, of course, the suicide of my friend Aaron Swartz. Aaron had turned me onto this work. He had forced me to give up what I was doing before and to do this. And so as I thought about the anniversary of his death, I said I wanted to find something that I could do to make me physically as miserable as I had been emotionally for the prior 12 months. So I decided to go for a walk in January across the state of New Hampshire. And the idea of New Hampshire, of course, was that this is where the first presidential primary happens. But it also is a place that famously gave us this incredible woman, Doris Haddock, aka Granny D. And Granny D is a woman who at the age of 88 started a walk in Los Angeles across the United States with a sign on her chest that said, "For Campaign Finance Reform." And 13 months later, 3,200 miles later, she walked into Washington, D.C. with hundreds following her, including a whole bunch of congressmen who had gotten in their cars and driven out to meet her a mile before she came in, to celebrate this movement she was starting to demand a change in the way our campaigns were funded. Now, Aaron had started me on this walk. I didn't have the time or the strength to do Granny D's walk, so I decided to remix them, to put them together. So we said, let's walk from the top of New Hampshire to the bottom. And did I tell you that was to be happening in January, right? So we would walk. I put a blog post up, said, I'm going to do this. If you want to do it with me, let me know. And that gave birth to the New Hampshire Rebellion. And in that first year, more than 200 people participated in that walk. And then in the summer, we did a similar short walk, 16 miles up the coast, and 500 people participated in that. And in this last January, we had 4 separate routes and found with those 4 walks more than 500 walkers with 27 million steps taken to continue this work that Granny D had started with the aim to recruit leaders, this time we call them citizens of New Hampshire, to step up and to ask a question. Because, of course, presidential candidates live with these people for the 2 years prior to an election. So the question we wanted them to ask was, what specific reforms will you advance to end the corrupting influence of money in politics? And the idea was, if we could find enough in New Hampshire to talk about this, we could make this issue salient. And knock on wood, I'm hoping this is wood because I don't want to jinx this. It is working, this project. The site begins to collect the candidates who have been asked, and candidates, of course, Democrats are usually pretty good at this, but the point is Republicans, too, are increasingly focusing on this issue in a way that makes it clear they, too, think this is a corrupt system. Bloomberg News just wrote the story about Lindsey Graham, campaign finance reform curious, as he describes why he hates Citizens United too. And the idea behind this is that if they can see that this issue is salient to New Hampshire voters, as the 400 of them go to New Hampshire and try to be elected, maybe they will think maybe this issue is an issue we should take on too. So that a slice of New Hampshire's voters, even just 50,000 voters, could make this issue decide that election, and if that's true, then conventional wisdom here too would change to say winning here is possible. Now the strategy then is Congress and the president. You can think of strategy a little bit like this. It's like we have these 2 huge steel bars that we are moving together, and if we get them close enough, they will spark into reform. That's the idea, that's the plan. Here's the question, is it enough? Because as hard as all of us work on this, there's a residual doubt. Maybe it's not enough. Maybe it's not enough. In my book, Republic Lost, I described another strategy. So the idea is, imagine some respected leader. You pick the context. Respected leader, whether politician or not, whether young or old. But here's the idea. Find an adult. An adult. And then imagine her campaign. And what that adult does is she runs, and she makes one promise. She says, if I'm elected, I'm going to pass fundamental reform. I'm going to hold Congress hostage until they pass this reform, and then I'm going to resign. And when I resign, my vice president becomes president. So the point is, if this matures, then the whole fight in the election is who the vice president is. And if someone did this, and had about $100 million, but okay, put that aside. If they did this, then I think it's certain that reform becomes credible. Reform becomes irresistible because it gives us a reason to rally. To rally to this because we know that if that candidate were elected, there is no ambiguity about what the election's about. And if there's no ambiguity, there's no way a Congress could resist it. And if there's no way a Congress could resist it, they're going to roll over in the first 2 hours so they can get that person out of Washington, eject the adults, and go back to the children playing the way they like to play. This would be change with a reason to believe in it, because we could see how this change might happen. It might be that's necessary. It might be. But we have to wage this fight as if we can't expect a hero to step in. As if all we have is the work we can do to bring a Congress around to the things a Congress knows it must do. So let me end with just this final reflection. I'm sure in this crowd I don't have to tell you who this extraordinary man is, Cenk. Cenk's a friend. Weirdly, we are a lot alike. It doesn't look like that maybe, but he and I were both Republicans as kids. His father, like mine, was a capitalist who started businesses. We have the same values of reform right now. And the other thing we share is that we are weepers in movies. Cenk tweeted this 2 weeks ago, a month ago. I just watched Selma movie, cried through most of it. That's how you fight for freedom. What are we willing to do for freedom? What are we willing to do? It was 50 years ago and 2 weeks when Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered in Marion, Alabama. He was on a march. It was a campaign in Alabama to recruit black voters to register. At the time, 1% of black voters were registered in Alabama. And the reason just 1% were registered were that black voters had to pass a test to register. But white voters, because of a grandfather clause, did not. And the questions on the test were questions like, name all 67 county judges in Alabama. Or when was Oklahoma admitted to the Union? Or, I swear this was a question, how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap? And if you can't answer those questions, you weren't allowed to be registered. And so Jimmy Lee Jackson was fighting with many others for an equal right to vote. But after he was murdered, the movement was terrified that the depression of that event would stop the progress they had seen. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's director, James Bevel, decided they would do something to rally the hope of this movement. And what they would do is launch a march, a long march, from Selma to Montgomery. And 50 years ago and 1 week, that march happened. And as the blood from that march spilled across television sets across the world, America understood what was at stake. But the truth is, that blood had an effect. because it was 1 week after the Selma massacre that Lyndon Baines Johnson stood
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President,
before the country
members of the Congress,
and asked for reform.
I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
The dignity of man and the destiny of our democracy. African Americans didn't have the vote, an equal vote. So they walked, they protested, they fought, and they died for that equality, for that dignity, the dignity of equal citizens. But the truth is, they had a kind of advantage. They knew they were unequal. They got it. In the equals versus unequals categories, they understood which side they stood on. They understood it because they were taught it in thousands of contexts of their life, and not only in the context of voting. Almost every sphere they knew. They knew they were not equal citizens. And so the subtle shades of color helped them see what was true. Now, we live in the digital age. It's the age of black and white, the binary, an age of either or. And in that binary, we are lulled into believing because we can vote, we must be equal. But the truth is, we are not equal citizens. The truth is, we today are the unequals. And most of us don't even notice, because most of us haven't stepped back to connect, as Martin Luther King did, as Lyndon Johnson did, the incredible importance of equal participation in a democracy and equal citizens. They didn't have an equal right to vote. They walked, they protested, they fought for equality. We don't have the vote, an equal right to vote, not in the ballot election, but in the money election, not in a general election, but in the green primary. And so Cheng's question, what are we willing to do, is incredibly important. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to try everything and fail gloriously. I'm willing to have Politico write articles calling me an egghead, making fun of the way my voice sounds. That's fine. I'm willing to do anything if it helps us to see what will work. But the question is, what will you do? Because the operating system that is this democracy is not just going to ping one day with an update that will fix the democracy to make it function again. There's nothing here automatic about making this work. What it will take is sweat and courage. Not as much courage as they had. No one's going to die on this march, or if they will, let's say one has. Our one death is finished. No one's going to spray people with fire hoses. There will be no German shepherds biting at your necks. There will be no indignity of demanding you don't have a right to stay or be in a place because of something as ridiculous as the color of your skin. It won't be that hard. But it will take work, because every fight for equality takes work. This is the question. This is the moral question of our age. Can we claim the equality a democracy demands? Join us in that. Lead us. Beat us with your own organization. It doesn't matter, but you've got to step up to recognize what you can't deny, what we can't deny. That we've lost the equality that makes a democracy work, that we've got to fight for an equality to get it back. Thank you very much.
So I think we're going to get some Twitter questions. And the first one is from Jordan Brown. Larry, can strategies like there was for net neutrality affect things like campaign finance reform?
Yeah, so one of my favorite clips from Aaron's last speech was he was describing how SOPA was won. And what he said was, the reason we won is that everyone was the hero of their own story. Everyone took up a part of that fight without worrying about how to get permission or who they had to get permission from, but to take it up and to make it a success. And that combination of uncoordinated activity is what won. And that's the same thing that happened with net neutrality. I mean, I had forgotten we had first been on a panel here about network neutrality. And it was 5 years after I started working on that issue that we were here on this panel 10 years ago. That issue took forever, but it's an extraordinary victory because unlike stopping SOPA and PIPA, this was not about stopping something, this was about getting something passed. Now, it was getting something passed in an agency, it wasn't Congress. But the power which the people who organized that movement demonstrated, from the organization Aaron started, Demand Progress, to an extraordinary group of entities that were so powerfully successful in rallying people to this, that we can see from that energy the kind of energy this cause will take as well. Everybody has to take it as an obligation to do something, not sit and wait for the orders from anybody, but to join or to lead. That's what this will take.
John Boutros asks, how can we keep campaign finance from becoming a partisan issue?
Yeah, the first step is to make it not a partisan issue, because right now people think it's a partisan issue. This is the issue you struggle with all the time, because the striking thing 10 years ago was to find a Republican, a man who had worked for McCain, who had worked for Bush, a credible, powerful player in the field, recognized this was a critical issue that Republicans had to take up. And most people think of it as the sort of issue only Democrats care about. And the Democrats do a lot to make people think that. I think one of the most destructive things that was done in the last election cycle was when Harry Reid brought to the floor of the United States Senate a proposal to amend the Constitution to overturn Citizens United. Now, to get that passed, it would take 2/3 vote. He knew there was no chance in hell he would get a 2/3 vote. Not a single Republican voted for it. But what he was doing was using that to raise money for Democrats. So the double irony of using an anti-money in politics proposal to raise money for Democrats in the election is a certain way to certify that this is an issue that is partisan. But right now, we're beginning to see this turn around. Another organization you participated in is Take Back Our Republic. The director of that organization is the guy who ran Dave Bratt's campaign. Dave Bratt is the guy who beat Eric Cantor by calling Eric Cantor a crony capitalist. He is organizing Republicans across the country to begin to rally Republicans to this cause. And in New Hampshire, what we are seeing is Republicans step up and talk about it. So we need to talk about it in a way that's inclusive of Republicans, and not tries to say we Democrats are better on this issue, because the truth is Democrats are just as bad on the way money influences what they do as Republicans. So all of us have to step up and admit that and do something to get reform.
Glenn Kaplan asks, what do you think about how shows like House of Cards help bring the conversation about government corruption to popular culture?
Oh, I was so hopeful about that show. But I don't think they've done it yet, because, in the first seasons, we learn the man who eventually becomes president is a murderer. And in the second season, in the current season, we discover he wants to destroy Social Security in order to give a bunch of people jobs. Neither of those two frames has anything to do with reality. Congress is not filled with a bunch of murderers, and the idea that the solution to our problems is to destroy Social Security is just not true. So I don't think they've yet given a way for people to understand the real influence of money in the system, and I'm hopeful they will, because it's a fantastic platform to do it.
Yeah, in China, of course, they think House of Cards is a documentary. You know, people ask me, is Washington like House of Cards? And I say, actually, it's like Veep, if you've ever watched Veep. It's much more realistic. Shrupti Shah asked, what is the connection between gerrymandering and the importance of the issue?
Yeah, so American democracy has about 10 problems we've got to solve. Gerrymandering is one of them. But I don't think we should solve gerrymandering before we solve the problem of money in politics. And the reason is, you know, if we move, we right now have a system where maybe 10 to 15% of the seats in Congress are really competitive. And if we move to a system where 40 or 50% of those seats were competitive, but we didn't change the way we fund elections, we will just increase the power of that 0.02%, not solved the problem of the power of the 0.02%. So if we fix the way we fund elections, then of course I think it's really important to also fix the problem that a vast majority of Americans don't feel they're represented because in fact their representative doesn't care about them because they're in a safe seat and therefore they have no reason to respond to the concerns of that person.
Boa Life asks, do you think a piece of this puzzle is encouraging the next generation of potential politicians to actually run?
Yeah, so we need new people to run. We need more people to run. But we need them to run for the purpose of changing the system. Because the problem in Congress is not that we've got not quite good enough people. The problem in Congress is we've got a system that takes even the best of them and turns them into people obsessively focused on what they need to do to make it possible to raise money. So we've stories galore about people who get into the system talking about the incredible importance of changing the way the campaigns are funded, and after 2 or 3 election cycles, it's as if they don't even remember this was an issue they cared about because they've been so trained, disciplined to behave the way the system wants you to behave, to spend all your time talking to these funders. And just think about what it does to them, right? We want leaders, but we force them to spend 30 to 70% of their time sucking up to other powerful people, people with money, finding ways to convince those powerful people to give them some of their money. So they're spending 30 to 70% of their time being supplicants, and then we want you to turn around and be leaders and think about how to make America better. Well, that flip doesn't happen easily. You need to give people the independence, the ability to be leaders by doing something other than spending all their time convincing more powerful people than them why they ought to be supported. The only people they should worry about convincing are voters, and as they do that regularly, then they would be more responsive to what our democracy is supposed to be.
I think there is some real generational things happening too. I can't remember the name of the organization or organizations, but some things have popped up just in the last few months about younger 30-ish sort of leaders. Like I think Nick Troiano's got something going on. He ran as an independent for Congress in Pittsburgh, but attracting new leaders based on sort of reform-minded principles. Lauren Tran asks, is there a government political model from another country that you admire, and if so, why?
So the problem with the comparison to other countries is that they don't have our First Amendment, which means they're not as constrained in what they can do about this. So every other comparable democracy has all sorts of rules which would be unconstitutional in our system. So countries like France ban television ads except for a certain chunk of time that their candidates are given for free. They restrict the time of the election. That's not possible under our Constitution. And most of them engage in massive amounts of public funding of elections. Now, they do it in a top-down way, basically write a check to parties that the parties use to fund their campaigns. The kind of reform that I support, or many people are talking about now, is bottom-up public funding. So, for example, Jim Rubin's, the candidate we supported in New Hampshire for the Republican primary, has advanced a proposal for $50 vouchers and immediate transparency of all spending and contributions. And the one twist that is the Republican twist is that you can either opt into the voucher system or you can opt into a system with no limits. But the point is, you give people the chance to fund their elections with massive amounts of small contributions as opposed to a few large contributions. No country has anything close to that because they do the simpler thing, which is just to write checks to the parties. But the thing that some countries achieve is a democracy where it's not just the tiniest fraction who are calling the shots up front. Not many do. I mean, this is a general problem with democracy. Tweedism is everywhere. But some do, and that's what we ought to be able to aspire to.
Claire Jordan asks, what changes outside of and beyond Mayday give you optimism about the future on this issue?
Mayday is doing one part, which is how do we get a Congress? How do we move a Congress, close the gap between a third and a half? The New Hampshire Rebellion and others in New Hampshire are doing the part related to a president. Cenk and the Wolf PAC are doing an incredible job to raise the constitutional stakes by pushing for an Article 5 convention that would give people the ability to propose amendments to the Constitution that Congress can't control. Groups like Every Voice are doing an incredible amount of work inside of Washington to connect the conversation of Washington to the rest of the country. I think there's an enormous number of fantastic groups doing work here. And again, my model of change is not a single organization with a single leader trying to take command of a massive army. The most we need is not a commander-in-chief, but maybe a therapist-in-chief who can kind of work with these many, many different groups to get them pushing in the right direction. So it's not a question of which in particular, it's something. Somebody, every single person should be doing something in this fight.
Here's a good one. Carmen Medina asks, is democracy essential to good governance? Good government. Good government. Or governance?
So, you know, strictly speaking, there have been a lot of good governments that haven't been democracies, but not over time. So there might be periods of time where there's some benevolent dictator who does things pretty well, but over time that changes. So the guarantee of democracy is not that every single moment it will be better than a committee of experts, but that it's a system to guarantee it has some connection, some tie. So I have no desire to move away from a democracy. I'd like to try a democracy for a while, see how that works.
Okay, this looks like a good last question here. We're running out of time. Arizona Egalitarian asks, what's the next step?
Oh man, the next step is, I'm going to have a drink after this, actually. The next step is you are going to do something. You're going to go up and you're going to sign up, and you're going to sign up either with us or with someone else, but you're going to recognize what you've got to do. And make some of the sacrifice, some of the hard work here pay off. You know, the hardest thing about that defeat was the way in which the world made it seem as if none of this was worth the effort. And God knows we worked as hard as we possibly could. And not just us, others across the country worked as hard as they possibly could. And when you work as hard as you possibly can and you fail spectacularly, the desire, the ease to give up is quite attractive. So the way you keep people in the movement is you join the movement. The way you convince people that there's something that can be done is that you actually do something. And you recognize that if you don't, then the burden of this is going to fall on you. Because that's the striking thing. I think, you know, when I think, well, what's the equivalent of a group, you know, like African Americans recognize they needed to step up and demand their equality? What's the equivalent today? And the truth is, one line is, you know, those over 40 versus those under 40. Because every single important issue that we talk about, climate change, healthcare, the debt, student loans, the inability of our economy to compete, innovation, stupid technology policies, copyright, whatever these issues are issues that don't really affect you and me. I mean, you know, climate change is terrible, but we're going to be okay for the rest of our life. Social Security, well, I know it's going to be around, House of Cards notwithstanding, for the rest of my life. Healthcare will be fine. I'll have healthcare. I got a job. People I know have a job. There's like nothing in the future other than just lamenting about the democracy we're leaving for our kids. But for our kids, things are really awful, really awful. Climate change will hit them. The debt is going to crush them. The inability to have a healthcare system that delivers healthy care at a reasonable cost will hit them. The fact that our economy falls behind because cronies control what happens in Washington hits them. So somehow we have to get them to recognize that they need to step up. They need to be the ones to recognize if they don't grab back their democracy will crush them. And this generation, not under 40, let's say under 25, it is so hard to convince them. There's a reason to step up. After Obama was elected, Rock the Vote, which turns out turned out the largest number of voters they could in 2008, 2010 found that a significant number were not going to vote. So they polled them, and their number one reason by far was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. That attitude leads people to tune out. But somehow we have to break through, that we can't afford, you can't afford to tune out. And we have the tools, you have the tools, to tune in and to take the steps from what happened in SOPA, what happened with net neutrality, and make it happen with this too. If you stand up, if you step up.
And scene.
And we're sourcing the ladies that will come to our academy in two avenues. First of all, through other companies that would like to take our program and have us train their ladies, or through the Ministry of Labor and the Human Resources Development Fund. We'll be working with ladies that then don't have jobs. And what we would do is work with almost like preferred vendors and do on-the-job training where they've got 2 days in our academy and 3 days on the job.